Good morning. Thank you for attending today's webinar, What is a Refusal to Test and Who Determines It? And I really appreciate all of you that have taken the time out of your day to meet with us and find out more about refusals to test. Part 40 in the DOT regulations outline refusals for drug and alcohol testing. Specifically, you want to mark 40.191, that's the refusal to take a drug test, and you want to mark 40.261, that's a refusal to take an alcohol test. You want to make sure, again, if you're having that alcohol test or a drug test, refer to the appropriate regulation. And this should be all of our best friend, ODAPSY's employer guidelines, what you need to know about DOT drug and alcohol testing. Great information in there, a great section on refusals. There's great sections on 40.25, there's a lot of great information in there, and you can also download it here. What is a refusal to test and who determines it? Okay. All types of refusals have clear instructions from the DOT. Some refusals have that final determination by the MRO, and some refusals have a final determination by a DER or employer. Refusal consequences are also under Part 40, cannot be overturned by arbitration, grievance, state court, or other non-federal adjudicating personnel. Everything that happens with that refusal stands because it is that MRO or employer's responsibility to determine that refusal. Limitations. There's a certain group of people out there that cannot tell us a drug test is a refusal or an alcohol test is refusal. I want you to take a couple seconds, think about who you think that might be. What group of people cannot tell us a drug or alcohol test is a refusal? It's actually some service agents. The service agents include collectors, BATs, and saliva technicians. And some may be thinking, oh my gosh, but I get those all the time. I have someone go to the clinic or collectors on site, they tell me that they refuse to take the test. I take that as a refusal. But what we're going to go through today is reminding you that's just step one. That's not the refusal. There's some things that we have to do as the employer to walk through those processes. Actually, the DOT Part 40.35 or 355 says making a collection site refusal decision is a non-delegatable duty of the actual employer. Service agents, such as collectors, breath alcohol technicians, or screening technicians, are not and have never been authorized to make the decision. The service agent's role is to provide information to the employer, and that would be regarding the circumstances of the event. Really, what that service agent's role is to document, here's what's happened, along with doing the proper collection procedures, of course, but their job is to tell you as the employer what happened during that event. When you have that information as the employer, it's your responsibility to contact that collector or BAT or to gain more information. When you get that alcohol testing form back and you look at step 2 and you're seeing, or the remarks in step 3 and you're seeing all these comments, you need to then take that as your call to action. You should also consider any information from the employee to determine if there's evidence that maybe excuse their conduct. Why did that employee refuse to take the test? Why did that employee not show up at the collection site after we told them? You need to dig into that and find out what happened. When you gather all that information, you're going to take that entirety of the circumstances into account and make a decision whether you feel a true refusal occurred. The thing about a refusal is that it's based specifically on facts and DOT instructions. Don't use your personal opinion. You know what? If that person's been here forever and they're a reliable worker, but they said, hey, I'm not taking this drug test, you can't go back and say, I don't believe him. This guy has been here for 20 years. He's my uncle. He's the best. You can't ever do that. Don't go back and look at their past positive or refusal to test. If they say, I wasn't selected for the test, that's not a refusal or a reason not to take a test. and any claims to have misunderstood the collector's instructions to remain at a collection site. Again, we've got that 40.191 and 261 to look into. Now, MRO refusals actually are going to come from the drug tests. They're pretty clear cut. It's going to be written on the result if it's a refusal. It's very clear cut. But our employer decided refusals are not. A BAT or an STT or a collector will provide you the information of a potential refusal. See, I've got potential in quotes. And the employer then will investigate the facts. The employer matches the actions with the actual federal regs, and the employer cannot match a citation. If you can't determine it as a refusal, then it's not a refusal. When you have a refusal, you want to make sure you're looking at the paperwork. Ensure there's no errors. If there's a fatal flaw, it's not a refusal. That's a fatal flaw. And if it's a correctable error, you can fix it. The regulations also talk about fatal flaws and correctable flaws. You want to refer to that to make sure that that is also in there. And you want to ensure the case is accurately and thoroughly documented. Okay, don't keep that information in your head. Write it on paper, put it in the file, so you've got that information for when that information comes up. Whether the person refused or not refused, you're going to want to keep that information. Again, as the employer, final decision as to whether the refusal has occurred. Again, evaluate, I can't say this enough, evaluate the actions of the employee during the testing event, and even if you determine it's not a refusal, document it. As a collector or MRO, when an employee refuses to participate in the testing process which you're involved, you must terminate the portion of the testing process in which you are involved to document the refusal of the test. Collectors must immediately notify the DER and ensure that refusal notification is received. Referring physicians that maybe are going through and looking at shy bladder must notify the MRO and that DER. As collectors, you must note that refusal in the remarks and sign and date the CCF. Okay, again, the employers might need that additional information. A good practice out there for collectors is to actually pick up the phone and make the call to the employer. The regulations say you should notify the employer, but truthfully, make sure if you are a collector or if you're a DER, tell your collectors in these events, get that DER on the phone. DERs have a little bit of power out there. They have that opportunity to talk to the employee and say, this is your last chance. You can, if you don't need to refuse this, you can take this test. There's just a lot of things if you involve your DER that can go through and maybe alter the result of what could have occurred. Collection site personnel must only describe facts that occurred, and the employer again makes that final determination. Investigating refusals, again, you might want to incorporate more people. If that person was escorted to the facility by a supervisor, ask that supervisor what happened. What happened when this occurred? The collector, technician, or site staff, the employee, or even the MRO. I'd like to walk through some specific examples of refusals and how to handle them. Okay. Failing to appear for any test except a pre-employment test within a reasonable time when directed to report. The decision maker is going to be the employer, but what are they going to do first? They're going to review that collection site information. If that person is escorted by a supervisor, you might want to talk to that person as well. Find out what happened on the way to the collection event. If the employee did not get to the site or spent too much time getting there, it's a refusal to test. If you're doing random testing and you're not escorting your employee to the collection facility, it is a good idea, I would say, a good idea to go in and say, okay, Holly, you've been selected for a random test. You need to immediately proceed to the collection site. It looks like you'll be there and you could be there in 15 minutes. If you're not there within 15 minutes, it will be considered a refusal to test. whatever that time frame would be. Also, you want to also make sure that collection site knows you're coming, because who is the one who's going to tell you they're not there in 15 minutes? The collection site. Have that information and dialogue with that collection site to say, hey, if Holly Rainwater's not there in 15 minutes, please call me. Then you have the full circle of events that have occurred. Again, you want to review how that notification happened. You want to have them ensure that they proceed immediately to collection location, stop doing current duties or tasks, and they proceed to the location, whether it's on or off site. If they say, whoa, I've got all this other paperwork to do and this train isn't going to get out, once that notification occurs, you're now on notice. That person does need to proceed to the location. The individual notifying the employee of the requirement to test starts the process, okay? It's a little different for pre-employment, which we'll talk about, but you must be aware of the requirements to report prohibited behaviors. You, as the employer, you might be transporting that employee, and supervisor must report the behavior during that transportation. If maybe they were belligerent, or if they said, I ain't going to do that, blah, 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 blah. You need to make sure that employee understands and the supervisor understands the ramifications of if that behavior occurs. Pre-employment refusals. And I know pre-employment has different meanings in all of the regulatory modes, but really a pre-employment test is the first time working regulated duties, right? And a pre-employment test with an applicant might not be a refusal to test. And here's why. When we start that testing process, when you are dealing with somebody working regulated service for the first time, that applicant, once the collector hands the donor the cup, the collection process begins. Okay. If you call someone, if I call Georgia over here and I say, George, I need you to take a pre-employment test. You're an applicant. Go tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Georgia's okay, I'll go. 3 o'clock comes, Georgia, who I want to hire for this new position, doesn't show up. As an employer, I can't call that a refusal. Why? Because that applicant isn't even an employee yet. Okay, they can change their mind about the job offer, even if they're in the waiting room. Georgia could be sitting there for an hour and say, I'm done, I'm walking out. She can walk out because she hasn't been handed that cup yet. Maybe they get a phone call when they're at the clinic that gives them a better job offer. You just want to make sure that all those situations are looked into until that transfer of that cup occurs. It's not a refusal to test. If that does happen, the collector will note that the employee left during the collection process. Again, the employer would evaluate the situation. Again, it's a best practice to keep that documentation with you and with those documents. The next type of refusal, failing to remain at the testing site until the testing process is complete. An employee who leaves the testing site before the testing process commences for pre-employment is not considered a refusal to test. We just talked about that. But not staying at that collection site, the employer makes that determination. If the collector reports the employee left the collection site before the testing was complete, it's a refusal. There's a lot of these, but one of the types of situations that comes to my mind immediately with this is when someone goes to the clinic or a collector comes on site, they provide their first sample is out of range, or maybe it's cold and short. And then the collector said, now we have to do a second collection under direct observe. Sometimes a lot of those people will leave. Okay, now that would be a refusal to test because they did not stay during the entire testing process. Refusal 3 is failure to attempt to provide breath or urine. An employee who does not provide breath or urine because he or she has left the testing site before the testing process commenced for a free employment test is not refused. Okay, again, the decision maker in this situation is the employer, okay? And again, if the collector reports the employee left the collection site, it is a refusal. In the case of a directly observed collection, refusal number 4 comes into place, or else it can happen during a monitored collection where you fail to permit or the monitoring or observation of the testing process for that specimen. If that person does have to provide that cold urine, we do that second collection under direct observation, and they say, oh, heck, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to watch me provide a sample. That is a refusal to test, because that is definitely a procedure that is walked through and talked about in Part 40. The decision maker is the employer, and the employer ordered an observation test, or the collector required the collector to be monitored or observed. It's a refusal if the employee does not permit it to occur. And something I'll add in this portion, and I don't know if it's as prevalent now as it maybe was back in 10 years ago, or in 2008, when the directly observed procedures changed with the lowering of the pants and raising the shirt. But sometimes there is belligerent behavior during this. Make sure that if you are a collector, you do not have to accept that type of behavior. Let them know, if you continue to behave like this, I will consider it a refusal to test, because now they're failing to permit that observation. Refusal 5, fail to provide a sufficient quantity of breath or urine without a valid medical explanation. And this is what we call shy lung, shy bladder. Okay, there's 2 types of decision makers in this process. There is the MRO. So if it's a failure to have a sufficient quantity of urine, the MRO is going to come into place. And for alcohol tests, you'll have them go to an evaluating physician. That evaluating physician will make that determination. The MRO finds that there was no medical reason for the employee to provide an insufficient amount of urine, it is a refusal. Or if they don't provide enough breath, it's a refusal to test. I would also recommend in this situation that as a DER, you are working with your collection network to make sure that if these events happen, that you're brought into the loop. Because what do you want to make sure? You want to make sure, like for urine, a full 3 hours was offered. Did we offer that person water during the time? You want to walk through all those steps. I know one common error that I have found is that first attempt doesn't really happen, meaning that the collector may hand the cup to the employee, and the collector or the donor might say, I don't have to go. Then they say, okay, that's your first attempt. But remember, that first attempt is when they cross that threshold. As an employer, you still have a few things to look into as well. Refusal 6, fail to decline to take a second test as directed by the collector or the employer for drug testing. The decision maker is the employer. If the employer or collector directs the employee to take an additional test as required or permitted by the DOT, the employee does not, it is a refusal. Number 7, failure to undergo a medical evaluation as required by the MRO or the employer's designated employer representative. The MRO is going to make that decision. If the employee does not go in for their medical evaluation or does not permit it, it is a refusal. Failure to cooperate with the testing process is refusal 8. The employer is the decision maker after reviewing that collector documentation. Some refusals to cooperate are they refuse to empty their pockets, behave in a confrontational manner that disrupts the process, they refuse to take off their hat, gloves, coat, overalls, and fail to wash their hands. Just any belligerent behavior, if tell them this is not acceptable, you're going to stop, or it's going to be considered refusal to test. That behavior by your collectors does not need to be tolerated. Failure to cooperate with any part of the testing process, you want to just go in and say, did the employee participate in all aspects of the pre-collection? But refusing to sign a service agent's intake form is not a DOT refusal. If they go in and they're like, I'm not going to sign this, I don't want to give you all of this information, that's not a refusal. The refusal is when it's to that DOT form. You want to look at, was a specimen provided? Did they complete all the instructions? I always say, would you treat your grandma that way? If that behavior is just really looking like it's not appropriate. It would be a refusal. Refusal 9, fail to follow an observer's instructions to raise and lower clothing and turn around during a directly observed test. If someone fails to do that, that information will come to the employer after they review the documentation. If the employee does not follow the instructions so that the observer can check for a prosthetic or other device that could interfere with the collection process, it is a refusal. And remember, that has to occur during every attempt, not just the first attempt. That donor has 3 attempts that need to be directly observed. Each attempt needs to follow the same process under Part 40, raise and lower your clothing. Refusal 10, wear or possess a prosthetic or other device used to tamper with the collection process. Okay, that's going to, of course, those aren't going to go to the MRO because that test hasn't occurred yet. That's going to go to the employer after the review of the collector documentation. If the employee is found to have or wear a prosthetic device or other device that could carry urine or a urine substitute, it is a refusal. Number 11, admit to the alteration or substitution of a specimen to the collector. Okay, if, let's say, during the collection process, maybe urine, like a bottle of fake urine falls to the ground, that's not immediately a refusal. But if the donor says, I was going to use that to cheat the test, or if the collector goes, what is this? And they go, I don't know, that's not a refusal. But once they say, I was going to use it to alter or cheat the test, now you've got a refusal. Make sure as a collector you have all that documentation, provide it to the employer so the employer can make that determination if it was a refusal to test. If the employee, again, during the collection process admits to having tampered with the specimen, it's a refusal. Number 12, if the MRO reports that a verified, adulterated, or substituted drug test result, it is a refusal to take a drug test. And that, again, is all from the MRO. And if the laboratory confirms a reported adulterated or substituted specimen, the MRO says there's no medical reason for this result, it's a refusal. And the MRO will document that on the chain of custody and their result. Number 13, if you admit to the MRO to having adulterated or substituted the sample, again, back to that, similar to the collector, if on the phone with the MRO, that donor says, yep, I was going to cheat. That's why you got a red sample and a urine sample. I was going to use that red sample to cheat. Okay, the MRO makes that determination because that information has come to their attention. And that would occur during that medical review. Refusal 14. Now we're going to look at alcohol testing. It's that refusal to sign certification at step 2 of the alcohol test form. Okay, again, in step 1, we're putting the information about the collection event. You're putting in the employee name, ID number, the DER name, address, company information, verifying that ID. Step 2 has the information in there that says I am justifying, or whatever they say in there, that I'm going to submit to an alcohol test. It's my breath. If the employee says, I am not going to sign that, it's a refusal to test. If the employee says, I'll blow, but I'm not going to sign that, it's still a refusal to test. They have to sign step 2. The decision maker in that situation is an employer. And if the employee does not agree to have a test accomplished by signing step 2, it's a refusal. And this is why it's also critical to take a look at your documents on your ATFs, especially. If you get a result back and step 2 isn't signed, you need to go back to the collector and say, hey, what happened here? Why isn't step 2 signed, but everything else is here? I've got a result, I have this. And you need to get documentation when that happens, because if that collector proceeded and it should have been a refusal, it needs to be documented as such. If the collector inadvertently forgot to sign step 2 and that donor was not attempting to refuse to test, you want to get that too. So that's in that document so it doesn't look like a refusal to test. It was an employee error, or excuse me, a collector error. Some pitfalls, okay? Remember, DOT versus non-DOT, okay? You know, DOT has certain requirements, non-DOT does not. Make sure when you're looking at those refusals that you're being aware of the regulatory mode of the test. Intake forms at the collection site, those definitely, again, as we discussed, are not refusals to test if you don't complete those forms. Some other pitfalls are unclear count of interactions between the collector and the donor. What really did happen? You might get 4 bits of information, but it's really your job to really put all those pieces together. But it can be very difficult from time to time. And then also collectors giving bad instructions. The collector may say, I tried, but you just we have to trust our collectors, but we want to make sure as collectors we are doing our job as well. Again, documentation. If a collector writes, employee refused a second collection, well, that doesn't tell us much. It's pretty vague, right? So we want to make sure if you're a collector out there that you're getting all of the information or putting all the information on the report. Additionally, if you're a DER and you write employee refused second collection and that's all the documentation you have, that's pretty vague as well. Maybe it could be like Craig provided an insufficient cold sample at 12:30. I explained to him that I was going to package up the specimen and collect another specimen under direct observation. When I said that, I would watch the urine leave the body. He left the collection site. I discarded the cold sample, signed the CCF, and immediately notified the employer. Again, that is a better statement than just refused. Now you have a better story of what happened. And even in here, having what time that specimen was initially collected, what did the collector say to the donor? All of that information is very relevant. And I like in here especially, I notified that employer because that's important. Records related to DOT refusals must be maintained for at least 5 years. It includes the reasons why actions were not considered a refusal. If a DER can't read documentation and understand the specifics of a case, no one else can. Okay, if you have turnover, you're not going to know what that previous DER had in their head. It's very important to have that information in there. Other parties that are going to look at that documentation could be our auditors, FTA inspectors, FRA inspectors, FMCSA, could be future employers. Think about the clearinghouse. What kind of impact does it have to the clearinghouse if they have wrong information? Substance abuse professionals and attorneys. There's a lot of people that can be impacted by that documentation. And then there's also the consequences of refusing to test, right? It's not just this event happens and it goes away. There's still consequences. There's an immediate removal from safety sensitive duties. That's a consequence of a refusal. You can't let that person go back to work. There is that consequence. You also need to refer them to a SAP, right? Part 40 subpart O, they need to go through that process. Employees are prohibited from performing safety sensitive functions until Part 40's return to duty process is complete. That has to be completed from start to finish. And again, other modes have different regulations. For example, let's look at FRA. Anyone who refuses to do a drug test under FRA is unable to work in a regulated position for 9 months. And guess what? That includes pre-employment. If you have a person an applicant go in for a pre-employment drug test, take the cup, start the process, and then that person leaves during the process, that is an FRA refusal, and that person is unable to work in a regulated position for 9 months. Keep that in mind. And I do want to note on that regulated position in regards to non-regulated positions, FRA and DOT don't tell you how to manage those. It really could come down to where if someone was working in FRA and they had a refusal, that employer actually could put them in non-regulated duties. But again, they cannot work any regulated duties for 9 months. Georgia, I'm going to ask you if there's any questions.
Yes, we have a handful of questions that came in around that refusal section.
Okay.
So first one, it says, shouldn't the donor be escorted to the testing site and not go alone?
I would say that all depends on the employer. Definitely, I recommend it's a very good practice to escort that donor from start to finish because you've got that he said, she said. Additionally, you're taking that responsibility and moving it from yourself to a clinic. And if you're not having that communication from a clinic, there could be a breakdown. The regulations don't say you have to escort them, but it definitely is a great practice.
Our next question is a scenario. Say a team member is notified of a random selection, then they mark off sick and leave the property. Is this considered a refusal, or are there more facts to gather before making this determination?
It's very good information. So you're, as the employer, you're getting information third hand. You're not talking to anyone. It's your responsibility to go in and see what happened. What did they really say to that employee? Because one time I can say back in my career, I received documentation of a refusal to test. It was all over the ATF. It was all over the COC. And I was like, what the heck happened? Nobody called me. What happened? When I did my due diligence, what had happened was the donor came to the property. He saw the collector's bag. The donor left the property, called the manager. The manager said, or he told the manager, hey, I'm not coming in. I'm leaving. And then he goes, oh, by the way, and I quit. And they're like, no, you got to come back in. And he said, oh, no, I quit. So they accepted the resignation, but also called it a refusal to test. No time did anybody say, I need you to come in and take this drug test. If you don't take it, it's going to be a refusal to test. They just said, we saw the bag, he left, so it's a refusal, which if you go through and look at all the facts, there's not. Hopefully that answers the question.
All right, we got a good answer as a response.
Good.
All right, and then we have, what if the employee has checked in but not started the process?
If it is a pre-employment, again, they're an applicant, then it's not a refusal because maybe they were sitting in the waiting room and got a call to go work for another company and said, I'm going to go work there. That's not a refusal. But again, now there's a lot of things that could go on. If you have somebody that you've said, go to the clinic, take the test, it's a random test. If you don't take it, it's a refusal. The donor sits in the facility, waits to take the test, and then says, yeah, I'm done waiting. I'm going to go back to work because guess what? I have a 3 o'clock conference call I got to make. That could be a refusal to test.
All right, I think this is a good segue into another one we have. When the donor's at the clinic and they have not produced enough sample and the clinic says they're closing, what do they do?
I'd say fire the clinic. No, and this is important because this is where you have to have that communication with your clinics and your TPAs that you want to know what happens if I bring in someone at 2 o'clock and they have to provide for 3 hours and it's 5 o'clock and they close at 4. What do? You want to make sure that they stay open. It's really they're obligated, really, in my opinion, to stay open. But that's where you want to find out when is the last time you will take a drug test. Because some people, I talked to a clinic the other day, they said, don't send anybody in after 2. We won't take them. Okay, so then you have to find another clinic. Really, and those are things like if it was a Spark TS client that went to a clinic and the clinic said they were closed, I would say immediately escalate that to Georgia or myself so we can get involved with that clinic and let them know the clear expectations. Yeah, that's unfortunately, it is a reality.
The next question is in reference to refusal number 9. If the donor refuses to lower their pants and raise their top on the first attempt, what should the collector do?
Okay, so on the first attempt, if it's not okay, here we go. Failure to follow an observer's instructions to raise and lower clothing. We're asking if the first attempt they don't do that, Georgia, they're asking if they don't raise and lower their clothing on the first attempt,
Correct.
then let them know if you do not follow these instructions. Again, if you don't raise your shirt, lower your pants, turn around so I can ensure there's not a prosthetic device, and then I need you to provide that urine into the cup in front of me, and they refuse to do that, then it's a refusal to test. So it stops. Notify the DER, document what happened, you have a refusal to test. You don't just take the sample and try to do it on the second time. And vice versa. If they do the first one, they have the second one is also direct observed. They can't say, well, you looked the first time. You want to make sure that every time you follow the same instructions.
All right. Right now we only have one more question, unless somebody else sends one in, which feel free to do. Can you comment on the situation of putting someone back to work before they have completed the SAT programs and what they can do for work?
The thing about sometimes I remember when I started in the drug and alcohol world, it was always said, if your refusals also a lot of times worse than a positive. Okay. Really a refusal is somebody who's just saying, hey, I'm not going to do it. I am not going to do it. But if you're in a situation where you're like, you know what, they refuse to test and I want to bring them back to work before they've gone through the SAT process, that is your decision, but you cannot bring them back into any position that falls under the Department of Transportation. You can't put them on an airplane. You can't put them in a truck. You can't put them on a train. They can't be a roadway worker. They can't drive a transit bus. There is so much that they can't do. But if you're like, you know what, I want them to sit in the office and write reports for me. Okay, I guess that could be considered non-regulated work, and they could do that. Just make sure, a lot of times I would tell you to look at your processes, right? If you've got somebody who's refusing to test, what else are they going to do? If you bring them back to work and they refuse to drug test, what's their behavior going to be like? I would ask you to ask yourself that question. But yeah, again, non-regulated work. I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. Some companies do it, they bring them back, and others don't. That is immediate termination. I also actually have a blog on www.sparkts.net. We have several blogs in there. One of them is the refusal to test, and it's just really pretty much the same table that is in what employers need to know about drug testing. If you want any of that information, let us know. We'll get you those links. I thank everyone on behalf of Georgia and myself. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.